Last minute shakeup at 5:30 a.m., laundry situation not good. And when your focus is on helping your clients, it's easy to forget about yourself. But NASM knows trainers.
Morning ride is okay.
And staying in front of the day isn't always as
Nice
simple
ride.
as 1,
What's
2,
up?
3. So when the unexpected has you pressing pause,
What's the latest on creatine?
I'm going to get back to you on that.
let NASM1 help you press play. Visit NASM.org to sign up for a membership today.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about tips and information that you can use to drink more mindfully. I'm your host, Derek Brown, and I'm grateful that you're here with us today, where we're going to talk about a subject that maybe has become just a touch controversial in a way, and that is moderate drinking, right? We're going to get into a little bit about, can alcohol hurt you, right? I'm sure it's very clear if you're binge drinking 5 or more drinks, if you are high intensity drinking where you're having 10 or more drinks. I think we all know the answer to that. All right. That is not good for you. That is not healthy for you. That's very clear. It's when it gets into the more particulars. Is it a drop? Is it a drink? Is it 2 drinks? That's when we get into a little bit of the controversy around it. And the fact is that science is something that over time takes time to replicate, to make sure that we have the right information, and there are always going to be different opinions. That doesn't mean that we haven't come up to a general consensus, and I think that that's part of what we're going to talk about today. Myself, I've worked obviously in the alcohol industry in the sense that I've been a bartender, a bar owner. I've written about the topic. I also talk about mindful drinking and the necessity of, drinking in a way that connects with your values and goals, and understanding that there are health implications of alcohol. So for me, it's important to kind of like listen to different perspectives and understand it. But one perspective that I think is really important is the researchers, the people who are actually doing these studies and what they're getting out of them, so that we can come to a good decision for ourselves, whether we should have that drink or not. And so with no further ado, I want to bring in one of the foremost researchers on that, scientist and emeritus professor, Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research of the University of Victoria, a former director of Australia's National Drug Research Institute and fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He has over 450 publications on substance use epidemiology and policy responses, with a focus on alcohol-related harms. And he's been in just about every journal that you can imagine that matters to alcohol. So welcome to the show, Dr. Tim Stockwell.
Thank you, Derek. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, my pleasure to have you. And I want to just start out, before we get into any of the information about alcohol, I just want to find out your journey. Like, how did you get involved with alcohol research?
It's a long time ago. It's probably pretty much 50 years ago. I did a PhD at the University of Edinburgh and Scotland, and I had a choice. I got accepted to do a PhD, and it was the University of Edinburgh, and I had 3 possible tutors, and one of whom recommended I looked at alcohol and alcoholism. And that topic fascinated me, and I dived in.
Yeah.
And I guess I haven't come out the other end yet. So that's a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing. And obviously being in Scotland then means that there was access to incredible scotches. So, I can see that there's like dual sides of this already. When you think about your career, because over 50 years researching this is obviously a lot of information, what do you think some of your greatest kind of contributions to the research have been? I know that's no small question, but let's go big.
Well, being English, I'm, and Canadian now, I like to think I'm modest. So, look, if the things that I'm pretty pleased about that I know have made an impact, the first thing that comes to mind was coming up with the idea of minimum unit pricing for alcohol, which there's a Scottish connection there, because I was consulted by people in the Scottish government in the area of public health to help them design policies to address, because they're world-class high levels of alcohol misuse there and related harms. And anyway, through various discussions and meetings, we came up with this idea there should be a floor price on a unit of ethanol. So ethanol's the stuff that does harm.
Right.
Price is a real driver of how much is drunk, and so how much harm there is. And so if you put a floor price on, they call them units there in the UK.
Right.
And that'd be a small, like a wee dram of scotch, or a fairly measly sort of half pint of beer, a tiny, like, thimble full of wine. I mean, a really small, that's what they call a unit. And it took like 6 years of legal argument and debate and research. And eventually, I think it was May 2018, they introduced a 50 pence minimum price for a unit of alcohol. And the most amazing research program demonstrated deaths from related to alcohol went down.
Okay,
So
wow.
I'm pretty happy. I mean, look, huge numbers of people took part of this and implemented, but I know at some point there was this little discussion over a phone call. We came up with I suggested the idea of attaching a minimum price to a unit, and it just flew away. I didn't have to do much after that. There's lots of other people doing amazing work. I guess the other one is stoking the fire around the idea that alcohol is beneficial to people in, drunk moderately. It can actually be good for your heart. And with other people, I've been engaged in just looking at that very critically through a scientific lens as to whether that really stacks up.
That's great. Yeah. And we're going to jump into that in just a second. There's a little bit of translation that I should to share with our listeners, is that in the United States, where a lot of our listeners are, we go by a standard drink, right? Which is 1.5 ounces of, 40% ABV alcohol. It can get confusing. I like the unit approach because it seems to me that it's much easier to wrap your head around. Here in the United States, if somebody gets a Manhattan, they think, oh, that's one drink. But in fact, that could be as much as 2.5 drinks. Yeah.
That's a very good point, because it gets confused. The standard drink idea gets confused with the standard pour, and that can be unrelated to the percentage of ethanol, right? So the unit focuses on the amount of ethanol, and that's the thing. I mean, it gets us high, it does damage, or whatever it's going to do. It's the ethanol. So we need to measure that and look at the consequences and price accordingly. So.
Yeah, exactly. And then one other piece of translation, probably important. What is 50 pence? I think for an American audience, they get confused. Yeah.
Well, it's bouncing around rather a lot at the moment. As we're talking, the currency exchange rates. So, well, look, that's like a pound is, I don't know, it'd be about $1.20. So I guess we're talking 60 US cents, pretty much. Yeah, that would be my best guess at the moment. Maybe a little more, maybe like 65 cents.
Well, that's great. I mean, we know that you're a scientist and alcohol researcher, not an economist or, trade specialist. So thank you for taking that on. I appreciate it. Well, let's get into the discussion around moderate drinking, because I think that is where you mentioned kind of this process to get to the minimum unit pricing. And it sounds like you had to go through a lot of different, let's say stakeholders, different people, whether it's the government or policy people, researchers, and the public, alcohol industry, so forth. They're all kind of tossing this around with different angles. And moderate alcohol use, obviously, at some point, when we're going back to the kind of 60 Minutes and Morley Schaefer inviting glass, at one point, it was said, hey, if you're drinking wine and you're eating a quote unquote Mediterranean diet, it's healthy. You're good. Don't worry about it. Have 2 glasses of wine. But it seems like that has shifted.
Yes. Yes, there's been a big shift over the last 20 years, particularly. I would say you go back to 2020, it was 25 years ago. The mainstream opinion was that, it was pretty much proven. There was so many studies finding an association between longer life and drinking moderately. And mostly the scientists working in that area didn't regard wine as being critical for this. I mean, there are some unique ingredients in wine, but again, we're coming back to this thing called ethanol. So it's the ethanol in beer, spirits, or wine. It didn't matter what. It's an association observed, sometimes called the J-shaped curve, which describes, if you like, the fall and rise of your risk of dying with how much you drink. So the idea is, as you drink a little bit, your risk of dying from heart disease in particular comes down, but as you drink more, it comes back up, and that describes a nice J shape. So these are observations, associations, they're not causation, and that's the beginning of the story, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And then certainly, from the perspective of like, let's say I talk to one of my friends who's a wine writer, they're going to be like, oh, this is neo-prohibitionism and one drop's not going to kill you. But I think one thing that I think is important for people to understand is that for a scientist, or you can share this with me, of course, what I assume is for a scientist, you all are starting from a sort of precautionary perspective, right?
Yes.
Like, it's not, if you're a wine writer, you're trying to add to somebody's recreation and pleasure, right? And certainly somebody from an alcohol researcher is trying to establish, look, there's going to be some risk at almost any level, right? So I guess the question would be, how do you navigate that discussion? Like, as recognizing that there's some people who would say like, oh, one drop's not going to kill me. Why are they saying this? How do you approach that topic?
Yes, I've noticed, and it's been a feature in my work, whenever I've talked about this publicly or even privately, people can get people's backs up without, you have to be so careful to say, look, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not telling anybody what to do. I'm just trying to interpret evidence. And so, but because people are somehow very sensitive about their drinking, and if anyone criticizes alcohol, they're criticizing them in some way. So I think the best way to handle that is to acknowledge it, try and keep factual, and be open to the fact that you have to interpret evidence. That evidence doesn't sit there and tell you exactly what it means and how we apply it and how we use it in our lives. But we have to understand it clearly. And I really believe, for me, the overridingly important thing is to inform people so they can make good decisions. And I think that's kind of where your podcast is coming from, which I'm very happy to see. So, we have to be open to the fact it is still controversial. Not everybody agrees with this. I have a particular way of looking at the problem, which I think seems to be a lot of other people are coming around to agreeing with me that there's been problems with the science suggesting there's beneficial effects. And we have to look at that and do better studies. So I think at the moment, I would say there's grounds for skepticism about the idea that alcohol is good for you. And there's three kinds of evidence, and we can dive into any one of them if you like, but there's traditional experimental studies, randomized controlled trials are thought to give you the best evidence for what causes an outcome. We have these new genetic studies. They've got a fancy name, Mendelian randomization. So there are certain genes that we can be born with, nothing to do with our environments or anything else about our personalities. Certain genes predispose us to drink, not at all, a little, moderately, or a lot. And so people have looked at the genetic inheritance and related that to health outcomes. And then there's these observational studies where you interview, typically what's been done over the last 50 years. Thousands of people are interviewed at one point in time, and they're followed up through mortality records or healthcare records over the next 10, 20, even 30 years to see how long they live, or if they die, what they die from, if they get ill, what they get ill from.
Right.
Those are observational studies looking at associations. And each of those kinds of studies can be done well, or they can be done less well. And I think we have to look at the highest quality studies in each of those areas and say, yeah, we need more of those.
Yeah.
But the way it's looking now, I would say, strong grounds for skepticism that alcohol is good for you in moderation.
Great. Thank you for that. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, and I'm your host, Derek Brown. We are talking to Dr. Tim Stockwell about alcohol in moderation. And we love this discussion is great, especially when you're talking about the interpretation of it, which obviously in the United States, we have the nutritional guidelines for dietary guidelines for America that are coming up.
Yes.
And currently they recommend, depending on whether you're born a male at birth or female at birth, 2 drinks or 1 drink a night, which could add up over the week. And there is some discussion over whether that's going to change. There's these studies. One is from NASM, one is from the ICCPUD, and people are saying, well, they have slightly different takes on it. And I wondered if you would share, to the extent that you know, it seems like you probably do, what do you think about how those differeces show up?
Yeah, I'm very familiar, actually. I've made a point of making myself very familiar with the relevant reports. So there's long acronyms you give. So you mentioned ICPUD. Well, that's a group that was commissioned through the US Department of Health and Human Services to review the guidelines, the dietary guidelines specifically on alcohol. So that's like an official panel. And the methodology that panel used is exactly the same. And the people who did the analysis were, some of them were the same who I worked with for Canadian guidance on alcohol that was published 2 years ago. So exactly the same methodology, slightly different estimates on, at what point you can measure a particular level of risk from drinking. The other one you mentioned, NASM, that's the US National Academies on Science, Engineering and Medicine. That was unusually sprung up as a shadow maneuver. I believe it was funded. I won't go into all the details. I understand there was concern initially from the alcohol industry that the rather what's viewed as stringent guidelines developed in Canada would be recommended and adopted in the US.
Right. And
the alcohol industry wasn't happy. So somehow they stimulated this parallel review. And it's notable, and it was discussed in the New York Times and other areas, that the panel members initially were very friendly to the alcohol industry. They had a track record of doing research on moderate drinking and recommending moderate drinking and receiving industry funds. And I don't think that influence was wholly removed. There's I think 2 people had to be taken off the original panel membership because of these concerns about conflict of interest. They appear to be replaced with their friends. That's just my observation. So, and the results of there were a lot of very good scientists on the NASM panel. So it wasn't just those 2 people that were directly alcohol researchers. They did their work, I think, very, very clearly, very transparently. They did there was a lot to be admired and was excellent in what they did. But I've just published a critique a week ago of what they did, and my headline of that report is that the National Academies on Science, Engineering and Medicine were economical with the truth. So they told what was precisely correct about a tiny and very limited number of studies, because they excluded, for various reasons, almost everything that was relevant to the topic area. And they come up with different recommendations. They basically acknowledge that moderate drinking increases risk of breast cancer. But they also suggested that it reduced overall mortality by 22%. So if you're a moderate drinker, you have a 22% less risk of dying from an alcohol-related disorder than somebody who's not a drinker. Right. And there's so many scientific reasons for doubting that. And then going through the cardiovascular disease, I think they said that moderate drinking was associated with a 13% reduction in risk of dying of heart disease compared with a non-drinker. And that is very easy to dispute. And they couldn't find enough studies with their very stringent criteria to make any comments on cancers other than breast cancer, which flies in the face of so much research sponsored by the World Health Organization and their International Agency for Research on Cancer. So there's a table in my critique of that report which shows that, well, while they would find 4 studies on a particular cancer, other people have found 50. So, well, they say we haven't got enough evidence for the 4. Well, it's already been shown that moderate drinking increases risk of about 7 cancers at least, and probably more. So they then adopted very, very, I think, almost arbitrary criteria for restricting the studies they look at. And they say, we can't find enough. They couldn't find enough studies. They don't even reference the fact that other groups have found 20, 30, 40, 50 studies on these kinds of cancers. And that, yeah, there's an association. Anyway, so I personally have more faith in the scientific quality of this, what you refer to as the ICPAD, the official review of the dietary guidelines, which essentially said that your risk of dying from an alcohol-related cause gets above 1% if you have 7 or more drinks per week. That there's no safe level, and there's a slight increase in risk starting at a low level. So it's a tiny risk if you drink tiny amounts, and it gradually increases and then it accelerates and takes off. So some people say 1% extra risk of dying from alcohol-related causes, nothing. Sorry, I've actually misquoted you. That's at 9 drinks a week, it's 1%, and at 7 drinks a week, I think it's 1 in 1,000 increased risk.
Right.
That's
yeah. Which I think
to Google and double check, but that's my memory talking to you now.
Yeah. And if I recall, I think that's somewhere around the area of like getting into a car. So I think that there are people who are going to say that's an acceptable risk to me, which we totally, I got in a car today. I didn't even think about it. I didn't, look to the science to it. I just said, I got to go where I'm going. So I do understand that some people are going to say, hey, look, that's a risk I'm willing to take. Obviously, I just do want to highlight too, those people who are saying, oh, great, the NASM study said 22%, I'm going to live longer. There's a lot more complications. That alcohol, no amount of alcohol is certainly healthy for you. The question is it safe for you? And it sounds like where you're going with that, and where you're saying the science points is that because of the cancer, the 7 different types of cancer, because of the WHO and the research that we see worldwide, that there's a lot more concern about alcohol and, its effect on our mortality, our health, our lifespan, our health span too.
Yes, so that's a big shift. So if we believe that 60 Minutes program you referred to in the 1990s, which caused like a 40% increase in sales of wine, particularly red wine, you would be gripped with the idea that, it's going to make me live longer. So now the science and I think mainstream opinion is going towards saying, well, no, it's not on balance good for you. There may be some benefits, but they're overwhelmed by the risks. And if you want to live longer, you drink less. Right. So that's one of the message. But be informed and make your choice based. So there's a Gallup poll which shows that message has sunk home. So over the last 20 years, there's been a huge shift from people believing moderate drinking is positively healthy to only about 8% of Americans believing that's the case, and about 38%, I think it might actually be slightly bad for you or pose some risk to your health. Right. And about half the people say probably makes no difference.
Right.
So, but it's a big shift over the last 20 years from thinking, oh, it's good for me, to thinking, it might be slightly bad for me. But it's important for people to know, isn't it? I mean, it's a big deal. It's something we all do mostly. So I shouldn't say all. I mean, there's about, in the States, 65, 70% of people drink some alcohol. There's many people who don't. But you see it everywhere. So it's really important we know about this product. I also think it's really important that producers and government requires producers to inform consumers about the risks of their product so that we can make those decisions.
That's exactly right. I love that, because I think that's where it's at. I mean, everyone has a choice. But you don't really have a choice if you don't know the information, right? Yeah. Without that, there's no choice involved in it. There's just a default, an acceptance. And that, as you're saying, the research has changed. We have to look at that. We have to understand it. And we have to know maybe it will change in the future, although at this point it's doubtful, that it's going to change radically at this point, right? I assume that, there's always room for some kind of change, for updated information. But at this point, there's a pretty good consensus, would you say?
It's moving towards that,
okay.
I would say. I mean, I would say I was in the minority. Well, let's get this clear. 25 years ago, I wrote an editorial in the Medical Journal of Australia, of all places, I used to live in Australia, saying that people who doubted that alcohol is good for you in moderation could be, likened to members of the Flat Earth Society. The evidence was so strong. So I think there's been, a whole shift in thinking, a whole range of new evidence that's come to light, which has questioned that so clearly. And I think pretty much, I don't know, I'd say 70, 80% of people working in the field now accept that's the case. But there are holdouts, and they're not all funded by the alcohol industry. And science is like that. We need people, contrarians in science, people who are going to disagree with each other, find lines of argument. And in time, with this adversarial process going on, we will settle on, firmer and firmer evidence. And I think the consensus now is like, we need to be skeptical. If you're a consumer, you should know that the evidence is strongly questioned, that it's good for you in moderation, and more than likely it's doing you a little harm, or puts you at risk of a little harm if you're even a low volume drinker.
Right. And each person does have a different physiology. They have a different background. So some people, somebody who's born a woman at birth, who has a history of breast cancer, that might be different than somebody whose family has no instances of cancer, who, exercises daily. And, so there's all these kinds of factors, but, that's when it comes to public health, it must be quite a struggle. I'd love to hear about this. Like, how do you make a recommendation for everyone?
Yes, I think all these guidelines, you refer to the US Dietary Guidelines, they are making recommendations for everyone. They're saying at the moment, if you drink up to 1 drink a day, if you're a woman, you're going to get some benefits more. The risks are outweighed by the benefits. What they're saying at the 11 to 2 drinks a day for men. That is now what's been questioned. But to communicate that, I think we have to help people understand the risk in ways that they can get their head around. So a couple of ways, we have a website if people want to go look at it. It's called No Alcohol, KNOW, alcohol.ca. You can plug in how much you drink, your background, your age, and you can set goals. You can say how much you drink now, and you say, well, I want to drink this amount. What difference would that make to my health risks? And it will crunch the numbers, and it will tell you the equivalent risk in terms of cheeseburgers or tobacco cigarettes, or potential years of life or weeks or months of life lost for the average person. Now, some people dismiss that, because if it's 1 drink a day, one of the calculations is you're going to shave about 3 months off your life expectancy. People think, wow, I don't care. I'm going to be very old and it won't make any difference. As some young adults we talk to in focus groups. But what they don't realize is that that's an average. So this is taking account of people who might die from alcohol poisoning or a car crash or whatever it is tomorrow. And there might be people who live to 100 instead of 101. Or 101 3/4 or something like that. So it's a very average figure, and it doesn't imply a little loss of life at the very end of your life. It could be cut very short.
Yeah, great. That is thank you for sharing that, because I think it really does help. And one thing I realized that I probably should have asked you a little bit about earlier is, there were some of the confounding factors for the research that suggested alcohol was moderate alcohol was healthy for you, or could be healthy for you, involved something called sick quitters, right? So I'd love for you to explain this concept of sick quitters to the audience.
Okay, well, the big sort of revelation for me when I changed my mind on it, started looking at it, and I have to credit a former colleague of mine, Kay Middleton Fillmore, medical sociologist at the University of San Francisco, who had been pointing this out for a long time. The problem is this: a lot of these studies that follow people up over time and look at what they die from and relate that to how much they drink, they just assume if people say they're an abstainer at one point in time, they've always been an abstainer. But in fact, the problem is a lot of people, when they get unwell, they cut down on their drinking or stop. And they get counted as abstainers in these studies. And they get compared with people who are well enough to carry on drinking. So it's what we call reverse causation. And over time, if you look at older and older cohorts, what's happening? So the group of abstainers is expanding, and it's filling up with people who were unwell and gave up drinking or get counted as abstainers.
Right.
And then you've got these healthy surviving drinkers who are well enough to keep drinking, and that difference. So one in our papers, we've shown that if you get a young cohort and follow them up to 60, you don't get this J-shaped curve. You've got there before this bias happens. If you start with people in their 60s and 70s, you get a massive J-shaped curve because all the bias is already there. Now, mostly people are saying, oh, we just take the sick quitters out of the abstainer group. We ask people, have you ever used to be a drinker? And if they're former drinkers, you take them out.
Right.
But that only deals with half the bias.
Got
We've got a paper about to come out in which we said, well, no, you actually have to reallocate. If you're a former drinker, how much did you used to drink? Well, we're going to put you back in with the drinkers, because otherwise you're systematically biasing the drinkers to be healthier and healthier. As soon as somebody gets sick, you take them out of the study. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And so nearly all of these hundreds of studies either suffer from both of those kinds of biases, or at least one of them. And so we need to correct that. There's also another problem that moderate drinkers tend to be moderate people.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this inbuilt bias that people who are able to moderate are good in their lives, moderating lots of things. And they usually have other advantages, like being wealthy, better access to healthcare, they have better dental care, they have more education, they take more exercise, they eat more healthily. And so it's very hard to separate those things out, which is why you need randomized controlled trials, and you need genetic studies, and you have to put a big dose of, shovelful of salt on, the findings from these observational studies. They are so dodgy, both for the sick quitter problem and this confounding that people are very different. Moderate drinkers are very different from abstainers in lots of ways, unrelated to the drink itself, to the ethanol itself.
Wow. I'm so glad you went into detail about that, because I do think that it shows not only the information you gave, but it shows science is hard, right?
Yes.
Like thinking through these problems is very complicated, and we might come up with a solution and find it presents itself as a problem in the future, which is, is why we need very thoughtful people who are studying in depth these topics. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful you're here to help explain that. And then obviously, as somebody listening to this, they're going to say, great, fantastic information. How much can I drink? Right? Like, I mean, out of all of this, if you're looking at the recommendation, if you're, obviously you are part of the group that are making these, suggestions. What do you think is the right approach for dietary guidelines, for general recommendations on alcohol use?
I think the right approach is to plot the degree of risk in various ways. So you need like a technical background, which puts all the data and the stats in there. But for communication purposes, that needs to be explained. It might be percentage risk of dying prematurely from an alcohol-related cause. You could plot that. Or you could put it, like I mentioned before, in equivalent risk to tobacco cigarettes. Mm-hmm. So some various studies now indicate that the mortality risk of one tobacco cigarette is the same as one standard drink, US standard drink. And people need to if you give people that information, you're not saying, well, here's a safe level. There's no safe level. There's hardly anything we can do in life that's completely safe. Right. But here is the risk. This is, if you drink like this, it's like having 7 cheeseburgers a week, or it's like smoking, 10 cigarettes, or whatever. Or, one way that the best evidence we look at the moment suggests you might lose 6 months of life expectancy, or the average person drinking like you will lose 6 months of life expectancy. They could die tomorrow, or when they're 110, we don't know. But on average, that group of people will die sooner by 6 months than people not drinking. So that kind of information. So I think we get away from saying, here's a limit. Drink within this limit, you'll be fine. Then I think it comes down to practical things. Well, look, when are you safe? You know the risk and do your best, what's important to you. and maybe other things are important to you than this theoretical loss of life or something that will happen in the distance. And of course, when you drink, you don't care as much. So yes, there are other factors to consider, like immediate safety, and like, for example, what responsibilities you have, because it will impair judgment. So I think there's a whole range of things people need to consider in the moment and longer term.
I love that. That really corresponds very well with the way that we talk about mindful drinking. We say that a big part of it is weighing it against your values and goals. You really, if your goal is to, wake up the next morning bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, if you have a meeting, probably 10 drinks is not going to get you to that place. And obviously there's a lot of nuance in between, which you've already shared. And so thank you. So I've already gone way over the time that I told you I was going to keep you, but there's just so much information. So I'd just like to leave it with this. Is there anything else that you'd like to share about the work you're doing, or any, I know you mentioned noalcohol.ca, which sounds fantastic. I'm going right afterwards. And the recent paper you put out on the NASM, which we'll link in this episode. Is there any other information you'd like to share or point us to?
Just a little concluding note: the US Surgeon General recommended putting cancer warnings on alcohol, which probably raised a few eyebrows. And I really think the consumer's right to know argument is incredibly strong here. We have put such warning labels briefly in the Yukon Territory. For 29 days, cancer warning labels were put on all alcohol sold in the Yukon Territory next to Alaska, until the alcohol industry found out and threatened legal action, even though we were funded by the federal government. And it was the governments of the Yukon that decided to do this. They had to stop because of the legal threats from a powerful industry group. But we still were able to show that the warning labels reduced consumption and hence harm in the Yukon Territory. The consumption went down by 7%.
Wow.
Compared with the neighboring Northwest Territories, which didn't have those warning labels. So consumers' right to know, but curiously, it may actually also change behavior. Curiously, when we humans are equipped with knowledge about potential risks, we do change our behavior. And so I think this is where all alcohol policy needs to start from, informing consumers, because we're the citizens who make requests and demands of our elected representatives in a good democracy. So I think we need to start there with the science and interpreting it carefully and fairly for consumers to, say this is a big deal. We could have better policy on this thing we call alcohol.
That's great. And that's such a great way to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Stockwell. It was a true pleasure to have you, to learn from you, and to get all this information. I highly recommend people check out all of the work that you've done. It's such a great body of work. And as always, thank you all for joining us today. And here's to drinking mindfully.